So hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Lowenberg, and I am the Manager of Education for the Louisiana State Museum. It's great to see some familiar faces and names on the screen, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you to this month's Second Thursday lecture with Melissa Daggett, author of Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans. A couple of just quick housekeeping things. We are recording this evening's program, so you will all get a link to the recording after the program in case you missed part of it, or hello to the future people watching this who were unable to attend tonight. Also, the nature of the Zoom setting is such that we can hear each other sometimes more easily than we can in person. So I'll ask that you mute yourselves during the program so that there's not conflicting noise. I may mute you for you. It is not because we don't want to hear what you have to say. It's just how the platform works. So the way that the program will work is that I'm going to turn it over to Melissa in just a minute, who will be sharing with us, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. So please feel free to use the chat throughout the program to put your questions in, and I'll be sure to monitor the chat to make sure that we get to those questions after the presentation. We have several other programs coming up soon that you may be interested in. On November 12th, author Shane Leaf will be presenting on Giacomo, the native roots of Mardi Gras Indians. And on December 10th, Linnell Thomas, author, will be presenting on her book, Desire and Disaster in New Orleans, Tourism, Race, and Historical Memory. And that one will be online in the next few days. And you'll also, when I send you the recording, I'll send you a link to both of those programs as well. Also, if you'd like to purchase the book through the museum, you can do so through the 1850 House Museum store. And I am going to link to that in the chat now. And thank you to our partners at Friends of the Cabildo for sponsoring this program and all of our Second Thursday lectures. So I'd like to briefly introduce Melissa before I turn it over to her. Melissa Daggett is a native New Orleanian who has taught history and French in the Jefferson Parish public school system for more than 3 decades. Now she currently is teaching United States history at San Jacinto College in Texas. She's presenting tonight on her debut book, Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans, Life and Times of Henry Louis Rey, which chronicles the history of modern American spiritualism in the Crescent City. We are thrilled to have you here tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm definitely thrilled to be here. I'd like to thank the Louisiana State Museum for hosting, as well as the Friends of the Cabildo. And thank you, participants, for being here. I very much appreciate seeing you. I see some familiar faces and some familiar names, and hopefully we'll have a very good question and answer session after the presentation. So what I'm going to do is a PowerPoint. This is based on my book, Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans, The Life and Times of Henry Louis Rey. So let's just begin. So your screen should have changed. Did it change? Yes, it did. Okay, great. Okay. So first of all, once again, the title is Spiritualism in 19th Century New Orleans. This is based on my book, and my book actually was based on research at the University of New Orleans while I was pursuing a master's degree. So I became interested in spiritualism as initially a graduate student paper, and that transferred into a thesis, and my thesis director was Michael Mizell Nelson. And then from there, I decided to write a book. So the book had to be longer and had to encompass more aspects of spiritualism. So I'll begin with the Fox sisters. Now, spiritualism had been around for millenniums. People have tried to connect with the dead, but the Fox sisters did it a little bit differently, and that's why they're recognized as being the founders of modern American spiritualism. And I'd like for you to note that modern American spiritualism is kind of a relative term. In other words, it was modern back in 1850. It's not modern anymore. So let's begin with the Fox sisters. They were two young girls living in Hyattsville, New York, in a farmhouse. And during the winter, they started hearing these mysterious knocks, and they couldn't quite figure out what it was. So the girls decided to try to communicate with which they thought was a spirit. They developed a very primitive system. One knock, yes. Two was no. They made a more sophisticated type of communication by reciting the alphabet. When the correct letter came up, there was a knock. From this information, the girls determined that the spirit had been a peddler who passed through the area, stayed at that farmhouse many years prior to their residence, and was killed for his money and buried deep in, under the basement area. So the eerie tale of the murdered peddler might have ended at that point, except another sister, a much older sister, brought the two girls to Rochester, New York. And from there, they started doing seances for money. So in other words, they were making money from this. They had private seances, they had public seances. There were, of course, naysayers that believed they were frauds, but nobody could quite figure out how they did it. But finally they did. Finally, they basically unmasked their tricks. And you would have thought that spiritualism would have died at that point, but no, it picked up actually momentum. So from Western New York, it went to Eastern New York, to the Eastern Seaboard, especially Boston. Boston was like the epicenter of spiritualism. It was widely popular among all different types of people. It also went to the Midwest. But what about New Orleans? What about the South? It didn't make much of an impact in the South, at least initially. Spiritualism was an ism, and the South was against isms like abolitionism or feminism or radical. So it was associated also with a political type of political frame that they didn't like. So a lot of the people in the South were against spiritualism, but nevertheless, it does make an impact later on. So let's take a look briefly at a timeline. So the Fox sisters start this with the rapping in Hyattsville, New York. Hyattsville, by the way, doesn't exist anymore. And then in the early 1850s, it becomes popular. This is the name for the area in Western New York. And then the first recorded evidence of spiritualism is the Reverend Thomas Lake Harris. He arrives in New Orleans. He does the same type of things as you heard the Fox sisters did, having private and public seances. But it still doesn't have much of an impact. Spiritualism is accelerated, though, with the publication of Le Spiritualiste de la Nouvelle-Orléans. So here, the launching publication, apparently more people started to be into spiritualism. At the same time, the same year, another publication began in Boston. It was called The Banner of Light. This was a hugely popular in all the states and all the territories of the United States. And then the following year, two of the editors from the Banner of Light proceed to go to New Orleans. They were actually in New Orleans for a few months. So this is all well documented. The editors have the names there: Roland Squire, Thomas Gales Foster. It seems as if they were trying to expand spiritualism in the Deep South, as well as the readership of the Banner of Light. And also remember, New Orleans at this time was the third largest city in the United States. So when they left, though, one person in particular became very interested in spiritualism. That was Henry Louis Rey, a free man of color. In other words, he had African ancestry, but he was not a slave. He was actually more like a middle-class person. His father was a very successful real estate person. Anyway, Ray began his first seance register. So we're going to kind of follow along that pathway with Henry Louis Rey. Barthet, who was actually a member of the foreign French, in other words, people that came to New Orleans in the 1830s and 1840s, he terminates his publication saying the readership had gone down. But spiritualism, of course, was still very popular elsewhere. So here we have the typical seance circle. It was thought to produce harmony if you would have an equal number of men and women. And the word circle has various meanings. Circle in the sense of the geometric shape, circle in the sense of a cohesive group, and circle in the sense of a group that gathered on a regular basis. Some of these circles actually had names. The planchette was a forerunner of the Ouija board. So this is another thing they did. One or more people would have their hand on the, make it pointed out, would have their hand on the planchette. It was shaped like a heart. Sometimes there was a pencil that was placed in a circle. Sometimes there was a piece of paper here with letters, like the Ouija board. And sometimes they would just let it draw. So very popular in the North. Here is the banner head, the masthead of the Banner of Life, which I just love. It's so ornate and beautiful. You don't see that anymore. And you can see the date, 1857. So it was in publication for about 50 years until actually 1907, when it terminated publication. Now, I became interested in the Banner of Light. I thought, even though it was based in Boston, I might find some information about New Orleans. Some people told me no, that couldn't be, but no, I actually was correct about this. So the problem was to find copies of the Banner of Light, and I'm talking about like 2008. So I couldn't find it online, but then I found a full run of the Banner of Light, SMU in Dallas. So I went there, and sure enough, they had a full run, and it was like they were published a few years ago. They were in perfect condition. Once I returned to New Orleans, guess what? I found them online. But I didn't regret going there, because there is something about actually seeing the real item, the real document, touching it. And, it was really a great experience. So here's a little quiz for the audience. I want you to put in your chat box if you can figure out the name of the city. If there is one city in our universe that the spirits of the departed are in abundance, hovering over, anxious for its conversion, it is, do we have any correct answers, Sarah? Let's see, anybody know what city that might be?
We're getting a lot of answers of New Orleans.
That's right, very good. So once again, I got this from the Banner of Light. So this was a letter somebody wrote from New Orleans. Look at the year, 1858. So New Orleans even then had a reputation for the supernatural. So New Orleans, of course, as I just said earlier, was a huge city. It was third largest city. There was a huge amount of circulation coming from the north and from, of course, abroad. And that might have encouraged more spiritualists to come down the river and do the same things as Thomas Harris, and also those editors. So New Orleans started to become a center spiritualism in the late 1850s. This was another person from the North, Emma Harding. She was very popular. She did a lot of lectures talking about spiritualism. And so she came to New Orleans in the late 1850s, and she was very popular. She had large receptive Anglo and French audiences. So it was not only the French population that liked spiritualism, but also the North as people that were Americans, in other words, English speaking. When the lecture was finished, the hat was literally passed around. People would drop gold coins, and apparently she was fairly successful with this. But she returned north at the outbreak of the Civil War. Let's take a quick look at what New Orleans looked like during that time period. This is, of course, a beautiful, I'm going to blow it up a little bit. This is a beautiful map of New Orleans. It's like a work of art, but we're going to be focused upon this area. Well, actually, New Orleans didn't extend further north and didn't extend to the east and west. This area over here was actually Jefferson Parish. So, of course, the city began with the old quarter, the Vieux Carré, and then suburbs were added called Faubourgs. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And in case you're wondering what these long linear lines are, those are plantations. And over here, there was a little bit of New Orleans. A lot of that was owned by John McDonough. All right. So I'm going to be focused on two faubourgs because I'm focusing really on Henry Louis Rey's séance circles, although there were many in the Anglo community, or you might want to call them the American community. So the Faubourg Marigny was established around 1805. There were a lot of free people of color lived there, a lot of the French people. Faubourg, once again, means suburb. So I got this actually from a book by Scott Ellis. So Henry Louis Rey lived in the Faubourg Marigny in his childhood and most of his adult life. This is not actually his home, but this is the closest I could get to it. Columbus Street was a street that he lived on most of the time. This whole thing comes from the Notarial Archives Research Center. They actually had the real drawing there. And these were basically want ads to sell a particular piece of property. So you would see where it was located, get an idea of the square footage, and then, of course, get an idea of the house itself. So Henry Louis Rey lived on Columbus Street. He also lived on Villeray Street as well. So the Marigny was a place where the free people of color would gather for seances. Now, the other important suburb was Tremé. I think that's more people are familiar with Tremé. And by the way, these maps come from the Robinson maps. It's dated 1883, which is actually out of the time period of the seances. So Tremé was divided basically by the canal, the Carondelet Canal. This was a way for boats to go down, make a turn at the turning basin, which of course was called Basin, hence the name Basin Street. And within the Tremé area, of course, you had more free people of color living there. There was a beautiful marketplace, the Tremé Marketplace, and also Congo Square was there. Now, Henry Louis Rey, when he started his seance registers, was working for a man named Hacker, Eugene Hacker, originally from Saint-Domingue, Haiti. And he started keeping the registers beginning in 1858. So the office, the hardware store was near the Tremé Marketplace. So this is an original drawing of the Tremé Marketplace. It's again like a work of art. And once again, you can get the original. Well, you can't actually get the original, but you could get a scan from the Notarial Archives Research Center. I found it interesting that you would see English here, but also French. So you see where they're interacting, where French is basically losing ground and English is gaining ground. So those were that was one of the plans for the Tremé market. So once again, here's where the Tremé market was, actually a little bit further north. So this was basically the center of Tremé. You could consider it as the heart of Tremé, but you could consider the Congo Square as the heartbeat of Tremé, with gatherings, particularly on Sunday, slaves prior to the Civil War. Now, going back to that canal, so we see repurposing over and over. So the canal became less popular. It wasn't used as much. And then it became a street, Lafitte Street, and then a railroad. And today it's a linear park. And so that's where it came from. So getting back to Henry Louis Rey, he started keeping registers. He was not actually kind of a leader of his seance circle yet. He was attending seances, particularly those of Valmore, and I'll talk about a little bit more about him later. But the Civil War breaks out, and originally he was with a group called the Native Guard, the Confederate Native Guard. In other words, technically they were part of the Confederate Army, but they never actually took arms against the Union Army. So I'm showing you this to show you that the Confederate Native Guard eventually became the Union Native Guard. They were allowed to muster in to the Union Army. Of course, that was after the Union Army took over New Orleans under the leadership of Benjamin Butler. Now, I want to blow up this a little bit. I want to show you one person in particular. All right, this is Levine. His last name is Levine. And he was a childhood friend of Henry Louis Rey. They went to school together. They were also involved in the Couvent School, the Institut Catholique. And then he was a faithful member of the Séance Circle. And then still later, he was in the army with Rey. So the people of color, as well as other people, now were allowed to enlist in the army. But Louis Rey became disenchanted with the Union Army. He was actually a captain. Originally, he was a captain of the economy unit. And then he was still a captain in the Union Army, but he was under the leadership of white leadership. And the people who was in the army with him and with his particular unit were paid less. Their weaponry was not up at the same standard as the regular Union Army, and so on and so forth. So he left the Union Army in March of '63, but not everybody left. One person who stayed on was Andrew Caillou. So Rey returned to New Orleans and he picked up his seance registers once again. Andrew Caillou became a martyr hero of the seance circle. He died in an ill-fated attempt to capture the Mississippi River. This was the Battle of Port Hudson. But let's take a look at this sheet from the seance register. And you probably can figure out what it means even if you don't know French. Equality will come later. It is true, a prediction. And further on, he talks about martyrs being basically like stepping stones. To construct a building, the first stone must be placed there. You will need victims to serve as stepping stones to liberty. We have been the first steps. We will need more. So there are these recurring themes of optimism, even though people died, because they're laying the groundwork for social, economic, and legal equality. So they're very optimistic at the beginning. That'll change later. Okay, so let's get back to the séance registers. What about these today in the year 2020? Well, we can thank these two men for the séance registers. The man on the left, or rather the right, that is Francois Dupliquet. And quite briefly, he was the son of Antoine Dupliquet, who was the, during Reconstruction, Secretary of the Treasury, the State Secretary of Treasury. Dupliquet worked for his father at the State Treasury, and he became good friends with Henry Louis Rey. So he was entrusted with these séance registers. They were almost like sacred texts. Later on, the Anglo circles mentioned that the séance registers were very important, and they noted, and this is in the newspaper, the Picayune. They kept a careful record of all of its sitting and of spirit writings received until their record numbered many volumes. So apparently there were a number of circles that were keeping the registers, but the only ones we still have are those of Henry Louis Rey. Now they're called the Grandjean registers though. So let me explain that. So Francois Dupliquet's, eventually his son-in-law, was René Grandjean. He came from France via Haiti. He landed in New Orleans around 1912, and he wanted to marry Francois Dupliquet's daughter. But there was a problem because she was Black, at least technically. She was very light-skinned. So he went with Dupliquet and the daughter to Jamaica to get married. You had to get married outside of the United States. So when they returned to the United States, to New Orleans, apparently the registers were somewhere in New Orleans. Grandjean was very enthusiastic about spiritualism, and he began to go very meticulously through each of those registers, making notes. Where did he get information? He got the information from his father-in-law. His father-in-law had a very good memory, even though he was in his 80s. He remembered what went on during the seances. He remembered the political situation. He remembered the names and the places. So just to bring you up to date, Grandjean kept his registers even after Dupliquet passed. And in the year 1976, he gave all of these registers to the University of New Orleans with the help of Dr. Lodston. So that's why they're currently housed at the University of New Orleans. And hopefully they are digitized right now. The university special collections department is trying to put them online, but they're having some technical problems. So each register had what they call an index. Now, you would think an index would be at the back of the book, but actually it was at the beginning of the book. All right, that's page 2. Let me go back to page 1. I'm not going to have time to talk about each and every other person, but these were the spirit messengers. So Henry Louis Rey would have a séance circle, he would date it, he would transcribe it, and then later on put it in index. So these are the names of people that were the spirit messengers. The numbers are the page numbers. So you can see some were more popular than other, but I'm going to point out just a few. This one here is Antoine Brouillard. The name may ring a bell because one of the descendants wrote an account of how her ancestors from New Orleans went to New York and passed for white. It was called One Drop. Some of you may know the book. But this was, so you see that he was connected to spiritualism. Crowder was actually a white person who was involved in that ill-fated Port Hudson thing. So it was not only people of African ancestry, but also white people. Relatives, Pierre Crocker Jr., this was his brother-in-law who passed away, apparently from a suicide. And I could go on and on and on, but we don't have that much time. So I need to move on to other things. So Grandjean would make some remarks here, like this is 30th July. We'll talk about why that date was so important. John Henderson, he was somebody involved in the Mechanic Institute massacre. Jesus, and so on. Let's take a quick look at the page 2. So these registers are invaluable. Oops, I don't want to do that. Let me see. Let me make it big again. And once again, you can see some names based in alphabetical order. Marigny, that was the founder of Faubourgs, Marigny. Valmore, he was extremely powerful as far as being a medium. He was considered to be a healing medium. In other words, if he touched you, he could cure you. Now, apparently, he had connections with voodoo. Apparently, he was a voodoo priest who later moved over to spiritualism. So we see voodoo connections, actually. Père Antoine was a very popular priest, longtime priest at first St. Louis Church, later on St. Louis Cathedral. So he was very popular. And so a number of these names are relatives, but let's move on to the actual, and I'm going to blow this up so you can see it a little bit better. So they were kind of like letters. And so it begins in French. So once again, we can see French and English sort of intermingling. This is from Valmore, that popular medium I told you about. So he passed away in 1869. So originally he was like the very important medium. Then he was kind of like a participant. And still later, he was actually a person who returned from the dead to be a spirit messenger. So these are all part of the Grandjean register. So you can see he says, Henry, I am and for you with him, and so on and so forth. God bless you, friends. So comforting messages from the spirits. So here we also see Harriman présent. Harriman was a neighbor. One of the descendants later on went eventually to Los Angeles and New York, and he was another person who passed for white. You may be familiar with the book written by Michael Tisserand called Crazy, because Harriman, the relative, the son actually, wrote a book, well, actually, he was a cartoonist, George Harriman. I don't know all the names. I'm not familiar with all the names. Move on to the third one. Okay, so I have this one to show you some of Grandjean's writing, margin writing, talking about where this particular seance took place, Rue Conti. If we go further, we can see Pierre Crocker Jr. At first, I thought this was his father-in-law, but he talks about here alluding to suicide. And so we can get information, valuable information about people who passed away like 170 years ago. So that's Pierre Crocker. There was another Pierre Crocker as well. There was another son. Pierre Crocker, the older one, had a relationship with Marie Laveau's daughter. So another connection with voodoo. And the son's name was Victor Pierre Crocker, but sometimes he used that middle name. So these names are sometimes confusing. So to get back to the massacre. So quite briefly, what happened was The free people of color, along with supporters, white supporters in the South, wanted to reconvene the state legislature and have allow blacks to vote. But the police find out about this, and they invade where the convention was supposed to take place. So the place was called the Mechanics Institute. So there was an invasion. And then later on, Henry Louis Rey called this the Black Day of Independence. But once again, kind of encouraging people still that these were martyrs and heroes, and they were helping the cause of social justice for the rest of the people. Let's just move on. So that was 1866. So Rey was continuing on with the séance circles. Now when he returned to New Orleans, he became part of the state legislature. He was a representative. His focus was on education, and he managed to get a bill pushed through for a biracial school system in New Orleans, but initially it was delayed. Eventually it was realized in 1871, and still later, Rey became part of the school board. But in the meantime, Rey changed jobs, so to speak. He was appointed 3rd District Assessor, in other words, the tax assessor. And he worked at the Merchants Exchange. This, once again, is an original drawing. It was on Royal Street. Actually, it fronted 2 streets, Royal and Exchange Place. It was a beautiful building built in 1836. The building deteriorated, but it was revived a little bit later on in the modern day. There was a restaurant called Lux and some other commercial activity as well. Unfortunately, an arsonist set it on fire in 1960, and the Louisiana Landmark Society tried to save it. Unfortunately for that, it was just outside. It was in the 100 block of Royal Street, which was technically not part of the Vieux Carré. But nevertheless, they pushed forward trying to save this building, but all of a sudden it was torn down without any notice. So that was the end of that building. It's occupied by a hotel now. So Rey continues on with a séance circle called Le Cercle Harmonique, the harmony circle. Harmony was an important element within the circle. You didn't want spirits to be scared and not be there. The spirits wanted a calm atmosphere. So that was the focus for harmony. So over and over, you see these aphorisms repeated, and they're basically encouraging the circle to pursue their goals. Don't fear the future. They love capital letters, by the way. En avant. The banner of light is flying. Now, you may remember the publication called Banner of Light. So maybe that's a reference to that. Or it could be a kind of a symbolic reference, banner being something people follow. In other words, they believe in it. Light is something that's more civilized and actually enlightening, something that's good. Continue your route. So continue on pushing for social justice. So you see these repeated over and over, the séance in the registers. All right. So this is just once again from the Robinson maps. So here you see where the building was, and just follow along with me with the laser. So it changes its name. Originally it was Exchange Street. Now it's Exchange Place, Exchange Alley. Now you may notice that the alley actually here goes through this block. So originally it went through, and these buildings, some of them at least, were notaries. Why were there so many notaries? Well, number of reasons, but one of the big reasons was to record the sale of slaves, because there was a number of places nearby that sold slaves. But also the notaries took care of like marriage contracts and things like that. In fact, Ray's father signed his marriage contract right around here. So all of these buildings were torn down and replaced. So this is a picture showing how you could go directly to the St. Louis Hotel, but they were replaced by one square block that was occupied by the Louisiana State Supreme Court, which is of course still there today. Now, I think part of the problem maybe was there was not much landscape, because architects condemned that. One architect called it one of the worst examples of a public building to be found in all America. Another one called it a white elephant. But let's go across the street to the St. Louis Hotel. So this is originally the St. Louis Hotel. It became the state legislature. So Henry Louis Rey would have been there for whatever different meetings going on. He was a representative for several years. So for a while, it was the state capital. And remember that New Orleans was the capital of Louisiana during Reconstruction. Now, still later, the hotel deteriorated. But to get back to the hotel, so during Reconstruction in the 1870s, early 1870s, it starts to fall apart. And of course, the spirits were alarmed by this change of pace with Reconstruction. So the Louisiana Reconstruction government was here from 1874 to 1882. Now, 1874 was a year of the Battle of Liberty Place. That may ring a bell. This was a White League that came to the offices of the governor and later on proceeded to this building. They were about to burn it down on September the 14th, 1874, but somehow or another that was averted. So what about the Rey Circle? They became worried about now of meeting together. So the séance circle starts to fall apart, and that was just one of several reasons why it fell apart. For Rey's circle, the frustration of repeated political failures and the exposure to recurrent violence showed in the change of the style and content of the messages. So now they become more kind of melancholy and less optimistic. But the séance circle is still meeting. So this is where the slave trade took place within that building. That was so selling of slaves, but also other things. This is a big auction house. And that's why the notaries were nearby. To bring you up to date as far as that building, the hurricane came, the 1915 hurricane came and took off part of that dome that you just saw, but it exposed some architectural details that had been for years forgotten. Nathaniel Curtis, who later on becomes the first dean of the Tulane Architect School, did some drawings and pointed out some of these details. But the St. Louis Hotel was torn down and eventually replaced by the hotel. Curtis's son was one of the architects that was responsible trying to keep some of those details in. So, and you can see here, actually, the word still remaining on the side, change, to indicate that at one time it was an auction house. So we're very close to the Louisiana State Museum, which would be really literally around the corner. But to get back to Henry Louis Rey. So the Cercle was suffering from at least perceived problems from people like the white people in the White League. Rey continued on that biracial state, rather school system in Orleans Parish. But that all fell apart too with the end of Reconstruction, because the state superintendent was succeeded by Robert Lusher, and Lusher was at least partially responsible for getting rid of the school system and getting rid of the school board. And Rey was no longer a director on the Orleans Parish School. Now, the also another reason why the séance circle for Rey died off was he was eventually hired by, once again, an owner of a hardware store. In fact, Pitard was a relative of Eugene Hacker. So it's a little bit sad that Rey, a very intelligent, smart person, began in the 1850s in a hardware store, and he ended up in a hardware store doing basically the same job. So this is Pitard's hardware store, where he worked from 1877 up until 1894. Rey passed away in the year 1894, of all things, anthrax. He died of anthrax. And so, but the Cercle had long since disbanded. Another reason was some of the people in the Cercle had passed away, such as Joseph Levine that I mentioned earlier. A lot of the seances took place at his place of business on Esplanade. And then once he passed away, I guess people were reluctant to hold them. So the last message actually was one that said, "We are with you for an eternity." So it's kind of like a melancholy frame of mind of the spirits. And I imagine the people listening to the spirits. So towards the end, the spirits advise the mortals not to dwell on their sorrows, but to keep up the, thinking about their maybe possibly way in the future for social justice. But nevertheless, they were vanquished dreams of equality, beginning with Reconstruction, well, the end of Reconstruction, actually. So so this is what happened eventually to that space where the hardware store was occupied. So in the 1930s, it was torn down and replaced by Woolworths, where there was a lot of civic activism in 1960 with the sit-ins. I always thought that Henry Louis Rey, the spirit, was very happy about that. But still later, that Woolworths was torn down, despite having historical value, and replaced with the Hard Rock Hotel. Well, some of you know what happened to that. But I just want to point out this building here, that had been the Alamo Theater, a movie theater, but it was covered up with this awful looking facade. So still later, as you probably know, that's what happened to the Hard Rock Hotel. Now, did Henry Louis Rey have anything to do with it? I don't know. So what happened to Henry Louis Rey after he passed away? I was interested in finding out where he was interred. So my initial idea was to go to St. Louis Cemetery number 2, because I knew some of his relatives were buried there. Well, actually, you know, they had these vaults. So I thought, well, maybe I could just walk around and find his name somewhere. And then I thought, no, because a lot of these tombs have been vandalized, and these tablets with the names are no longer there. So I thought a better idea would be to call the Archdiocese of New Orleans, which I did do. And they were very nice. They were very helpful. They told me exactly where he was interred. And in fact, I would have never found it because, first of all, it wasn't in cemetery number 2. It was in cemetery number 1. Now, that cemetery is off limits to the public because of the infamous Marie Laveau pink painting. But anyway, here is, I'm going to blow it up a little bit. Here is where he's buried. And another reason why I would not have found it is because it was in the family vault, and his name is not actually on the tablet, but the Archdiocese told me that he was in the middle vault where it says Famille Pierre Crocker. You recall Pierre Crocker was the father-in-law. So that is where the remains of Henry Louis Rey were placed, as well as Pierre Crocker, as well as Henry Louis Rey's wife, Adele. But if you're curious, right above there, that was Pierre Crocker's mother-in-law, Manon Montreux. So some of these names may ring a bell because you hear them around New Orleans. You know, New Orleans is a very small town. So let me get back to that picture of Pitard. And thank you, Derek Pitard, for giving me this picture. The great-great-grandson gave me this picture via email. But when I looked at it, I knew that it wasn't actually taken like in the 1890s. It looked more modern, or relatively modern, by the clothes, but I still didn't know the year. And I asked him, well, what year was this taken in? And he didn't know. So I got busy looking at the picture closely. I want you to follow along and see if you can figure out how I figured out the exact month and year. So let's take a look. I'm going to go all the way around counterclockwise. So here we see Pitard, what they sold. Going back to the Alamo I told you about. That's, by the way, torn down, unfortunately. All right. All right, one more quick go around. So put in the chat box, how did I figure out the exact month and year? And I'm going to ask Sarah to check it out and see if anybody got the right answer. So Sarah, did anybody get the right answer?
So somebody had the same guess as me, which was the summer price.
Okay, well, I guess I'll have to just...
so far.
No, you want me to give him a little more time? That's not the right answer. Anybody got the right answer? I hope my brother's not doing this and cheating because he knows the right answer.
I think we got a right answer from Libby, the movie showing on the left.
Oh, that's right. Yes. The Half-Breed was showing at the Alamo, the adjacent movie theater. All right. So I came upon this and went through the magic of internet. I put the name of the movie in and Googled it. And sure enough, it was August 1916. So technology is an amazing thing, well, as long as it works. So let's wrap it up. So when I got to almost the very, very end of the book, I thought to myself, how could I sum up the book in one sentence? So this is what I did. This is the second to last sentence, and I always mispronounce it, the penultimate sentence. During the 19th and 20th centuries, mediums from all walks of life in hundreds of American towns and cities at different venues, espousing varying social and political agendas, and with diverse participants, sought to reach over the spiritual Rubicon to achieve the impossible. So thank you, University Press of New Orleans, Mississippi, for doing that. And here, of course, is a book cover. Once again, you can buy this book through Louisiana State Museum, through their 1850 store museum. And you can also purchase it through Octavia Books. So I'll give a little shout out to the local bookstore and also the University Press of Mississippi. So at this point, I'll conclude the presentation. I also have my contact information in case you have questions that you cannot do right now, or maybe something you think about later on. mmdaggett@yahoo.com. So thank you once again, Louisiana State Museum. Thank you, Friends of Cabildo, and thank you, participants. Sarah?
We have some great questions for you, a bunch of questions, just to give you a heads up, in the chat.
You want to stop sharing the screen, or should I keep it up?
We can stop sharing, and we'll put your contact information in the chat too, so people have it. I think you have to be the one to stop.
Do you want me to stop the screen sharing?
Yes, please.
All right, so stop that. Okay, it's going to take me a few seconds to navigate. Okay, I'm still navigating.
Great, getting some more questions. I think maybe I can do it.
Okay, can you?
Here we go.
Right.
I got it.
Okay, good. All right. So Sarah, I'm going to let you navigate through those questions or comments.
Yeah, so I'm going to kick us off with, I'm going to go chronological order, but a great, I think, introductory question. Could you define spiritualism?
Spiritualism is contact with the dead. I think that would be the simplest way. And as I noted earlier, modern American spiritualism was this particular way of contacting the dead. There had been, of course, millenniums of people trying to contact the dead, but just very simply, it's just contact with the dead. Some people considered it like a religion. And by the way, let me add that this was one of the attractions for the Black Creoles. In other words, the Black Creoles were disenchanted with the Catholic Church to a large degree. They weren't disenchanted with individuals, but just the people at the upper hierarchy. A good example would be the Abbé Perchet at that time. And these were people that were still trying to hold on to power and trying to, not helping out the Black Creoles in their pursuit of social and economic justice. But there was different types of spiritualism going on, even within New Orleans. So you had these Anglo circles kind of in the area where the Garden District is. And as I mentioned, the French circles were more in Faubourgs, Marigny, Faubourgs, Tremé, to a lesser extent, Vieux Carré. Even there were circles that were just French, but mostly white French. There were crossovers too, because I know Henry Louis Rey had Caucasian people to séance circles because he makes references to that. So this is another value of these Grand Jean registers. So we get a better picture of what the free people of color, and then later on the former free people of color, were like. And there's kind of like a myth that the free people of color were kind of elitists and they kind of stuck to themselves and they didn't have anything to do with other French people or or the Anglos, but I think it was much more fluid. Although from the seance circles, you know that the main people were people coming from that Black Creole elite. So I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you. And a quick clarifying question, is the Banner of Light is a spiritual newspaper, is that correct?
It started out what they call a romance newspaper. It was published, I believe, once a week. And they started publishing things related to spiritualism. Like they would have, one thing was kind of interesting. They would have a guy who, well, supposedly would get letters. It's kind of like Karnak. And he would like, you know, not open the letter, okay? He would figure out what it was, the question was, and then he would answer it. That was a column. There was another one, the name was Conant, C-O-N-A-N-T, you know, contacting the dead, a columnist, particularly after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, spiritualism was kind of ramped up because so many people had died on the battlefield without their loved ones. This was a horrible thing for somebody to die and there was not one loved one there. I read an interesting book talking about this, this nation of grievance. But anyway, it even said that they would pull out little pictures and put them around their bedside when they knew they were going to die, and that, you know, so they could see their loved ones. So the loved ones that had survived tried to contact the person that had died. So there was, after the Civil War, there was a column about that, you know, telling, well, what happened to this person? What happened to that person? There was also kind of letting people know where different popular spiritualists were going. There were a lot of more itinerant. This was a good way for women to make money. I didn't really get into that, but women were considered to be more capable of contacting the dead. They had, I don't know, special connection to the dead. So it was particularly popular with young, beautiful mediums. One in particular was named Cora Hatch, and she actually came to New Orleans too after the Civil War with her husband. Okay, I hope I answered your question. So
Great,
spiritualism
thank you.
became more
Yes.
popular.
Yeah. And are seance registers commonly found elsewhere in other places outside New Orleans?
Oh, those registers? No, they're housed in the special collections at the Earl K. Long Library, which is at the University of New Orleans. They're housed there. And actually, I read recently that the library is closed to any outside personnel because of COVID. Like I said earlier, I talked to the head librarian there, Connie Phelps, and she told me they are trying to put it online on the Louisiana Digital Library. I got an email from her today. There is a technical problem in doing it. But once it's done, this is going to be a great boom for genealogists, and it's going to be a boom for historians, and it's going to be a boom for the general public. Now, bear in mind, most of these are in French. There's some things in English. René Grandjean did translate some of them into English. So maybe people could read those. All right, so the short answer is no. Apparently there were other registers, but I know Valmore has, but according to Grandjean, they were destroyed by relatives. This is what happens to a lot of these records. People do spring cleaning and they see some old books and hey, it's time to, you know, do some spring cleaning and throw them away. So I think that's where a lot of these books have gone to, unfortunately.
Gotcha. And how were these mediums received by the New Orleans community?
How was the what received?
the mediums. How did the larger New Orleans community react to this?
Valmore was extremely popular, and the Catholic Church started targeting. I've mentioned his name before, Abbé Perchet. Valmore had public seances where he was actually a blacksmith, and he would come out, and there were people, and they wanted to be healed. This was like one of those healing mediums, kind of like what you might have seen in Benjamin Butler, that type of thing. There's kind of a connection to the spiritual churches later on in the 1930s of the healing mediums, but he was very popular. He was also mentioned by Joseph Barthé. Joseph Barthé was outraged that Valmore could not do any more public seances. So he was very popular. So once again, we see where the white community was very receptive to some of these people that had African ancestry. I followed along a little bit with Valmore, but he did pass away in 1869. Still very popular.
That actually brings us, I think, to the next question. Did seances tend to be segregated? And if so, what were the differences between those with people of color and with white people?
Well, I think that the Anglos, I'll just call them Anglos, these were the white Americans, they tended to live on the other side of Canal Street. The Faubourg Sainte-Marie was the first suburb, but then they continued outward to where the Garden District is. There were a number of seances there among the Anglos. Now, it appears that those circles didn't have a connection with the Black Creoles or people of African ancestry or the French even. Going back to that first one I talked about, Barthé, he had, when I looked through his information, the Spiritualiste de la Nouvelle Orléans, the names were like Anglo names. So I think he had people coming from the English-speaking part of New Orleans. And he, once again, he did mention Valmore. So, and then of course the Black Creoles under Rey, you saw those index. So I know Rey sometimes had white participants. I know, like, for instance, in one of the seances, Eugene Hacker's wife was there. Eugene Hacker was Rey's employer, and he was white. And so she was at the seance circle trying to contact her husband, who, according to the register, had committed suicide related to financial problems.
Thank you. And this next question, I apologize in advance for my pronunciation. This is from Heather. So Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, but was Aristide Mary involved?
Who?
Aristide, A-R-I-S-T-I-D-E, Mary involved.
He wasn't mentioned. Okay, so he came a little bit later after the circle. I think you're talking about maybe the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson thing. Is that right? Is that right? Plessy versus Ferguson. He was involved in that case. So he was more 1890s. I couldn't find a connection between Rey and Plessy versus Ferguson. I couldn't find that. Although some of the people he had connections with, particularly with the Economy Society, they had connections with Plessy versus Ferguson. They were part of that citizen group that filed the case, the original case. And for those who maybe don't know, Plessy versus Ferguson was a big landmark Supreme Court decision that decided that it was legal to segregate, but that case came from Homer Plessy. But I couldn't find a direct connection between the two. apparently they lived very close together. Plus he lived on Claiborne, and Ray was about a block and a half away. So I'm thinking they probably knew each other. And for those people from New Orleans, this is where the mother-in-law used to be, the bar. Some of you may remember that. Okay.
Great, thank you. And Heather said yes, that was yes. A couple quick comments I just want to read because they're great comments from Jael. For genealogists and historians like myself, not being able to have access to that cemetery without a family past or tour guide is so disheartening. And from Keisha, but the end of spiritualism and the spiritualist church didn't end. Can you speak on the connection to Mother Leafy Anderson and Mother Catherine Seals?
All right, well, thank you for those questions. I actually discussed that in the book. I discussed connections with voodoo, connections with, like you just mentioned, the spiritual church, and also something called the spiritualist church. They sound very similar. So I'm not really going to go into the voodoo thing, but your question is about Leafy Anderson, right? So I think there was a connection. Now, these people, these matriarchs, tended to be dominated by women. So once again, we see women being although there were some men in the spiritualist church, they tended to be the leaders. There was also the thing about faith healing, but they would say, no, we're not spiritualists. They would kind of move away from that. These people also tended to be, but not always, tended to be kind of the working class people, although it was still popular among wealthier people in New Orleans. They liked to go to the spiritualist church. Some of these people were very entertaining. They would, like, one of them in particular, I forgot her name, Mother, what was the two names you gave me?
Mother Leafy Anderson and Mother Catherine Seals.
Okay. Catherine Seals, she was a protege of Mother Leafy Anderson. And she had a church. There were a number of churches around New Orleans. We're talking about 1920s, 1930. So Mother Catherine, I really love this. She was kind of theatrical. She would begin her church by descending down, well, with some type of ropes and all, and then she would arrive, and then she would declare, "Children, I've come here to do good, not evil." I have a kind of a connection with her. She just seemed like a wonderful, warm person. But these spiritual churches kind of died out. Now, there's something else called the spiritualist church, and I didn't have, had some time restraints, so I didn't really get into that. But going back to Grandjean, he was very interested in spiritualism, but there was something called a spiritualist church. So it was like a congregation that would meet in a church. So I found out that Grandjean went to a church on a regular basis. This was like 1920s, and it was on Spain Street. It was on Spain Street. So I went down. I was always interested in finding these places. So I go up and down Spain Street. I don't see the church, at least the address. And so finally, it was kind of a shot in the dark. I contacted the person who lived there. And I said, was there ever a church there? He said, yeah. He said, you come on over. So I go over there, and he showed me, it was a big room, and he had found some things. He had kept it, and he actually kept the sign. And it's in my book. I took a picture, and it's in the book. It's the original sign, and thank goodness he didn't throw it away in the trash. He took it and put it over his mantle. the first church, a divine fellowship of spiritualism. And he put it over the mantle. And then I was in his kitchen, and it was kind of like an island. And he said, "Oh, this is the altar." He said, "I was going to move it from the back all the way to the front, but it was too heavy. So I just left it in the kitchen. I'm going to use it for, the altar for an island." And so then my last question was, well, have you ever seen any spirits? Are there any spirits in your house? And you know what he said? He said, "The only spirits that are in my house are the ones you drink." So, but anyway, it was very nice of him to invite me over. There were 3 different spiritualist churches. Now, they're different from the spiritual churches. There are a number of people have written about the spiritual churches, but there are these connections, yes. Oh, and one more thing. There were a number of spiritualist churches in Chicago. And once again, you have this connection with Black Creoles going to Chicago, bringing their religion, and having these churches. One of the people, she lived to a pretty advanced age. That was the person I mentioned earlier, Cora Hatch Daniels Richmond. She had a church, but a number of the Black Creoles went to churches in Chicago, and they had correspondence actually with Dubuque. Some of the descendants of Dubuque would correspond to him, talking about, their church and their beliefs. So hope that answered your question.
Oh, great. And somebody just commented that there's still an active spiritualist church in Chicago.
So there's this connection from New Orleans to Chicago. I call these the destination cities. I kind of made up that name. But the destination cities for me are like, especially Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles. A lot of Black Creoles moved to these cities, especially during the 1890s, during the heyday of Jim Crow. So this was also going back to the Plessy versus Ferguson day. People were basically giving up, going to other places, looking for better jobs, better environment.
Absolutely. And I think we answered this, but just in case there's anything else to add, a related question, so skipping ahead a little bit, but I'll come back to the previous one. Jessica said, "I know there were devotees of spiritualism in my family well into the mid 20th century. Do any remnants of spiritualism remain in New Orleans today or elsewhere?"
I've heard of that too, actually, in my own family, and I don't want to go into all the spooky stuff, but it was like a cousin of my mother. This is in Alexandria, and the story was that she went to a séance when she was very young in Pineville, and they were having a séance, and apparently spirit, whatever it was, it got attached to her and was with her the rest of her life. So I've heard that stories, and I don't know, it's a little spooky, but some of my relatives swear to it, that that's true, that spirit stayed with her for the rest of her life. So I personally don't know. Maybe some of the participants can put something in the chat box of what they know. I'm always trying to get people to do maybe a seance with me, but people, I don't know, kind of negative about it, or they had a bad experience having a seance. I know my brother told me about a seance where the table started to rise up, and he was kind of done with seances after that. So I don't know.
I think clarifying question, Pineville, Rapides.
Yeah, right, Rapides Parish. So Pineville would be right across from Alexandria. But to give you a little bit of family background, my family originated, well, they were French. They moved to that area, originally Nacogdoches, then very, very early, and established a plantation, 1803. which is actually still there. It's now a tourist attraction. Anyway, I do have roots way back, French roots. So yeah, I'm very familiar with Rapides Parish.
Thank you. A question and then a related comment. I want to read with the question, but can you speak about spiritualism's connection to the suffragette movement? Do you know if Elizabeth Lyle Saxon attended any of Rey's seances while in New Orleans? And the related comment is, that would be interesting to know, being that Rey's niece is an interviewee in Saxon's Louisiana ex-slave narrative.
Yeah, I actually read that. Well, first of all, it's a little weird that she was interviewed, because you're talking about the WPA slave narratives, which were done in the 1930s and 1940s. So the object of this was to get some type of oral history from ex-slaves, but she wasn't actually an ex-slave. She was always free, and she was a relative of Rey. I believe that was her uncle, and her grandfather was Bartholomew Rey. And but there was some mistakes in the oral history. I did read that. I did read that slave narrative. But the big mistake that sometimes when people relate oral history, sometimes it's true, but sometimes the facts get a little confused, because she said Bartholomew Rey, the father of Henry Louis Rey, was all mad in the 1860s because slavery was ending and he had slaves. Now, he died in 1852. So that would not be true about the Civil War and all that. So go back to your question again. I think I missed part of the question.
Okay, so the original question was, can you speak about spiritualism's connection to the suffragette movement? Do you know if Elizabeth Lyle Saxon attended any of Rey's seances?
Actually, when I did the book originally, I had a lot of connections, but one of these peer readers didn't want me talking about all of these connections, but I do have some things. So going back to the Civil War, some of these people that came down, the carpetbaggers, the hated carpetbaggers, they brought along their wives, and they had connections to spiritualism and also the suffrage movement. So as I said earlier, one big reason why it didn't gain a big hold in the South is because of with feminism, abolitionism, with women that were advocating the right to vote. So one of these people was Laura DeForest Garden, and she wrote about spiritualism while she was in New Orleans, but later on she moved to California after the war, and she became the second woman lawyer in California, and she was instrumental in that movement to try to gain the vote in California. So I know at least of that connection. So there are a number of spiritualists, particularly in the North, that also had connections with the right to vote as well. And then after spiritualism kind of died out, they basically transformed. They moved into another movement, and like you said, that was the suffragette movement. Okay, particularly in California.
And just a follow-up comment was from Jael, who just said she was the one who left you a comment on Facebook. She used his niece in her thesis, which is so cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'm conscious of the fact that we only have a few minutes left, but we have just a couple more great questions. One is, any legendary stories as to the perils of those who were seen as charlatans?
Well, there's perils. There's tons of perils, and probably you picked it up already. I imagine the audience, the fight for social justice that we're having now. So that was going on during Reconstruction. And as I said, initially it looked good. And then that was overtaken by what they called the Bourbons, the Redeemers, took back the state government. Yes, so your answer is yes. In fact, let me give you a quote. Let's see if I can find it real quick. This was from one of those martyr heroes at the Mechanics Institute. And it kind of reminded me of the present day. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, so this is going back to the Mechanics Institute massacre. Give me a few seconds. It's a great quote. So the spirit returns, and she says, nothing can obscure the road of progress. So maybe this is kind of like Black Lives Matter, where people are getting this momentum. They're going down the route, but their route is a little bit different. So there's this this slogan, history repeats itself. Well, not exactly. It resonates. It's similar. All right, so let me finish the quote. Nothing can obscure the road of progress. The opposition, comparing it to the opposition. So this might be the opposition, as you mentioned, Charlottesville. The opposition, and this sounds so modern, but I got it directly from the register. The opposition will be a house of cards that will cave in under the breath of the will of people. Well, that sounds pretty inspiring. So that comes from Victor Lacroix. He was a victim at the Mechanic Institute massacre. He was actually mutilated. It was just horrible. I'll spare you the details, the gory details. So yeah, a lot of parallels,
Yeah, I think there's two more questions, and then I'm going to cut us off after that, but people have your email and we can send it out too. But also a quick comment from Emily, who said pre-COVID, there were public weekly spiritualism seances held at one of the shops in the quarter, which is cool. I don't know what shop. So question from Yvette, are there any locations or buildings connected to the spiritual movement that you did not mention in the lecture that are still standing today?
Are there connections between, okay,
any buildings or locations that are connected with the movement that are still standing today?
Well, actually there are, but I was a little hesitant to put it in the book because I didn't want people to be annoyed. The place I mentioned earlier where a lot of the seance circles took place was at his friend's place of business, Joseph Levine, and it was a cigar store. So I actually went there one day. It's like a private residence, and I knocked on the door, and I talked to the lady who lived there. She said she had never seen any spirits. She did tell me at one time somebody knocked on her door and said, look, my relatives lived here once, and showed her pictures, and you could tell it was the same house. All right. So mentioned already the Spirit Church, but that was like the 1920s. Henry Louis Rey's house on Columbus was destroyed. It's no longer there. It's a vacant lot. His other house on Villeray, in the book, I said it was destroyed by a fire, but thanks to Facebook, one of my Facebook friends contacted me and said, hey, I own that house, but it had a lot of damage from a fire. So in other words, Ray lived in that house, and because of the fire, he moved back to his original house. But the house on Villeray is still there. And I went by and took pictures. It's actually an Airbnb now. But my Facebook friend told me she did some research and found out what it was originally. So there was a fire that Ranjan talked about a lot, and it was like a crushing blow to Henry Louis Rey. I couldn't find any records in the newspaper. There weren't any at that time records from the fire department. The best idea I got was to look at the Robinson maps that we saw earlier. And if a number of houses looked like they were gone, then more than likely a fire had taken place. So I did that. And so I determined, yes, a fire must have been on this block. So yeah, I did go around to different places that were pointed out as places of where spirits were meeting.
Thank you. And I think our last question for now is from Jack. Did you discover connections between the spiritualists, mediums, and others you mentioned tonight with Christian Science?
Yeah, there are connections, and this is a reason why spiritualism died out, or at least receded in the 1880s and 1890s, because that was sort of the beginning of Christian Science. So people who were spiritualists kind of moved over to that. I believe I mentioned that in the book somewhere. But yes, there are connections with that. So that was another reason why spiritualism died out as far as this type of seance thing. Other reasons, apparently there were seance circles that were basically a lot of tricks going on, people behind the scenes making the knocks and playing music and things like that, or throwing things around. And they were exposed as fraud. There were a whole series of articles in the Times-Picayune about this, exposing spiritualists as frauds. So they gained this reputation as being frauds and not really being connecting to the dead, but basically magicians, sort of.
Thank you. This has been such a wonderful discussion, and it's great also to see all of the questions and the comments from people in the chat, and the connections that people are making. So thank you, Melissa, so much for all of your research and expertise, and for sharing it with us this evening. This has been wonderful. I am dropping your email into the chat, and also I will send out this recording in the next few days, probably after the storm, so that if anyone would like to revisit all or part of this program, you can. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you all are in Louisiana, please stay safe. If you are anywhere, please stay safe and dry. And we hope to see you again at a future program.
So thank you.
Thank you again. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. C'était mon plaisir.
Oh, merci beaucoup, c'était super, vraiment.
C'est mon plaisir.
Au revoir, madame, bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
À tout le monde.
Mélissa, merci.
French-speaking people in the audience.
Bravo, merci beaucoup.
C'est mon plaisir. Merci bien.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and log us off. Thank you again, Melissa. This has been wonderful. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Au revoir. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir tout le monde.